Pax vobiscum. Welcome back to the channel, and to another episode of The Vestal Virgin Reads. Today we shall continue our reading of Character, the Grandest Thing in the World by Orison Swett Marden, and we shall continue by reading and discussing Chapter 3, The Great-Hearted. It was a cold, dark evening, and the city lights only intensified by their sharp contrast the gloom of the storm. It was the time when wealthy shoppers were eating their hot dinners, when the stores were closing, and when the shop girls were plodding home. Many too poor to ride, tired with the long days standing and work. A shop girl was hurrying home through the slush after a hard day's work. She was a delicate girl, poorly dressed, and wholly unable to keep out the winter's cold with a thin fall cloak. She was evidently very timid and self-absorbed. A blind man was sitting in an alley by the pavement, silently offering pencils for sale to the heedless crowd. The wind and sleet beat upon him. He wore no overcoat. His thin hands clasped with purple fingers the wet sleet-covered pencils. He looked as if the cold had congealed him. The girl passed the man, as did the rest of the hurrying crowd. When she had walked half a block away, she fumbled in her pocket, and turned and walked back. For a moment she looked intently at the vendor of pencils, and when she saw that he gave no sign, she quietly dropped a 10-cent piece into his fingers and walked on. But she was evidently troubled, for her steps grew slower. Then she stopped, turned, and walked rapidly back to the dark alley, and the man half hiding in it. Bending over him, she said softly, "Are you really blind?" The man lifted his head and showed her his sightless eyes. Then, with an indescribable gesture, he pointed to his breast. There hung the dull badge of the Grand Army of the Republic. "I beg your pardon, sir," she said humbly. "Please give me back my 10 cents. "Yes, ma'am," he answered, and held out the coin. She took out her purse. It was a very thin one. It contained but 2 silver dollars, 1/3 of her week's hard earnings, all she had. She put $1 of it into his hand with the words, "Take this instead, for the dear Lord's sake, and go home now. You ought not to sit here in this bitter wind and sleet." Then she turned her steps homeward, pitying the wretched man, and thinking that no one had seen her. A poor woman, knowing that Dr. Goldsmith had studied psychic, and hearing of his great humanity, solicited him in a letter to send her something for her husband, who had lost his appetite and was reduced to the most melancholy state. The good-natured poet waited on her instantly, and after some discourse with his patient found him sinking in sickness and poverty. The doctor told him they should hear from him in an hour, when he would send them some pills which he believed would prove efficacious. He immediately went home and put 10 guineas into a chip box, with the following label, "These must be used as necessities require. Be patient and of good heart." At the Battle of Fredericksburg, hundreds of Union soldiers lay wounded on the field a whole day and night. The agonizing cries for water amongst the wounded were only answered by the roars of the guns. At last a Southern soldier, who could not endure these piteous cries any longer, begged his general to let him carry water to the suffering. The general told him it would be instant death to appear upon the field, but the cries of the unfortunates drowned the roar of guns to him at least, and he rushed out among the wounded and dying with a supply of water on his errand of mercy. Wandering eyes from both armies watched the brave fellow, as heedless of guns, he passed from soldier to soldier, gently raising his head and placing the cooling cup to his parched lips. The Union soldiers were so struck by the action of this boy in gray, risking his life for his enemy's sake, that they ceased firing from admiration for an hour and a half, as did the Confederates. During this whole time, the boy in gray went over the entire battlefield, giving drink to the thirsty, straightening cramped and mangled limbs, putting knapsacks under the heads of sufferers, spreading coats and blankets over them as tenderly as if they had been his own comrades. General Gordon is said to have had a great number of medals for which he cared nothing. There was a gold one, however, given to him by the Empress of China, with a special inscription engraved upon it, for which he had a great liking. But it suddenly disappeared. No one knew where or how. Years afterwards it was found out by a curious accident that Gordon had erased the inscription, sold the medal for £10, and sent the sum anonymously for the relief of the sufferers from the cotton famine at Manchester. There is one anecdote, matchless if not incredible, that reads like a fable out of the Orient. It relates to a Spanish Moor whose walk in his garden was interrupted by the inrush of a Spanish Cavalier who flung himself at his feet and implored protection, saying that the pursuers were seeking his life for having slain a Moor. Refuge was promised in the garden summer-house till midnight. Unlocking the door at the appointed hour, the Moor said, "You have killed my only son, but I pledged my word not to betray you." And he placed the murderer upon a mule, saying, "Flee while darkness conceals you. God is just, my faith is unspotted, and I have resigned judgment to him." Yet unless it is true that a pledge is sacred, the pillars of heaven may fall. Unless generosity of spirit prevails amongst men, there can never be upon earth an ideal life. The last best fruit, says Richter, which comes to late perfection, even in the kindliest soul, is tenderness toward the hard, forbearance toward the unforbearing, warmth of heart toward the cold, philanthropy toward the misanthropic. As we stand upon the seashore while the tide is coming in, one wave reaches up the beach far higher than any previous one, then recedes, and for some time none that follows comes up to its mark, but after a while the whole sea is there and beyond it, so now and then there comes a man-head and shoulders above his fellow-men, showing that nature has not lost her ideal of great-heartedness, and after a while even the average man will overtop the highest wave of noble manhood yet given to the world. One act of charity will teach us more about the love of God than 1,000 sermons. Robertson. This is the quote found at the beginning of Chapter 3, The Great-Hearted, and it is fitting when you look at the stories that Marden puts forward as examples of what it means to be great-hearted. We will discuss some of these stories, and try to answer the question of, what does it mean to be great-hearted? I found myself particularly interested in the first story, and I'd be interested to hear what each of you thought of it as well. Marden notes that the girl was timid and self-absorbed, meaning that she lacked confidence and was mostly preoccupied with her own affairs. And yet this timid girl, who, rightly so it would seem concerning the type of work she was doing, was so focused on herself and her survival, gave richly from her own fruits of her labor to a blind veteran freezing in an alley. But she didn't immediately stop and give her that $1. In fact, she didn't immediately stop at all. She walked on twice before finally returning and giving him the $1, and even then she asked for the 10-cent piece back initially. From my own viewpoint, I don't actually think that this reflects poorly on the girl's character. If anything, I think it highlights it. The story is one that we see routinely, maybe even in ourselves, and that is the story of reluctant charity, a type of charity that we have to work towards, fighting our own ego and our own self-absorbed nature to give richly to others. We discussed this a bit in the previous video, but there is no greater joy or gift of being able to help another, no matter how small a manner. But reason and other thoughts get in our way. We begin to question charity, holding it up to our own struggles and trying to find a way to justify not being charitable, until we end up simply continuing down the street. But I think deep down we as human beings feel drawn to help our fellow man, and it is the story of the girl walking back twice that I believe demonstrates this innate wish to help, while also showing the reality that charity isn't necessarily easy sometimes. And now as an American, the story of the Confederate soldier hit home with me in particular. The American Civil War in the first half of the 1860s was bloody and terrifying, literally pitting family against family, brother against brother, sister against sister. And yet here is a Confederate soldier on the battlefield, fighting for what he believes to be right, but what overarches even that is the sounds of suffering. Even though some of his own comrades had been killed by Union bullets, probably even by someone they once considered a friend or brother, this Confederate soldier took it upon himself to help the wounded, no matter the color of their uniform or skin. And here we get another glimpse into what Marden calls the great-hearted. This Confederate soldier certainly had a great heart. This man who by circumstance was standing where he was, he still had a great enough heart that could not turn from the suffering in front of him. We'll also take a look at the final example that Marden provides, that of the Spanish Moor and the Spanish Cavalier. I think truly that this story demonstrates the concept of a great heart, but also a heart of faith, honor, and the power of one's word. And when I say word, I say that with a capitalized W. Now, for some quick context, the phrase Spanish Moor, and this is information taken from Wikipedia, refers to an exonym, I can never say that word, excuse me, an exonym used by Christian Europeans to sort of designate Muslim populations of certain areas during the Middle Ages. The Moor is not a single distinct or self-defined people. It's a term, rather, that broadly refers to Muslims in Europe, excuse me. And the Cavalier, I believe, if I'm thinking of the correct time period, in this context refers to the soldier versus the actual fashion. Either way, the two were most likely at odds depending on the specific time period, and I wanted to provide that little background because I believe it highlights the point of the story a bit further. Now, in the story, Moor is walking in his garden when a Spanish cavalier suddenly appears and begs for his protection, and he openly admits that he slew a Moor. And yet here he is asking for protection from a Moor. The Spanish Moor, however, does take pity on the man and promises that he can stay in the garden summer house until midnight to avoid capture. But the twist of the story is when the Moor comes to send the Spanish cavalier on his way, the Moor tells him, "You have killed my only son, but I pledged my word not to betray you," and then says, "Flee while darkness conceals you. God is just, my faith is unspotted, and I have resigned judgment to him." The Moor demonstrates here many characteristics, I feel. Strength of character, honor, faith in God, mercy, and a binding of his word. Now, he could have flown into a rage and killed the cavalier for not only killing a fellow Moor, but for slaying his only son. But the Moor did not. He sent the cavalier on his way, showing great restraint, adhering to the word that he had given, even though his own heart was probably breaking. And so I think it very fitting that Marden follows the story with the following. "Yet unless it is true that a pledge is sacred, the pillars of heaven may fall. Unless generosity of spirit prevails amongst men, there can never be upon earth an ideal life." "The last best fruit," says Richter, "which comes to late perfection even in the kindliest soul, is tenderness toward the hard, forbearance toward the unforbearing, warmth of heart towards the cold, philanthropy towards the misanthropic." From this chapter I put forward this, that a great heart is a generous heart, a sacred heart, a heart that when it speaks with word, it speaks with honor, and drives one to keep their word. A great heart is kind, even to one's enemies when the opportunity allows. A great heart is warm, burning even when some want to blow it out. A great heart is giving even to those who wouldn't spit on you if you were on fire. A great heart is strong, and prevails even when our minds try to wrest us away from an opportunity to help. It is easy to simply walk on. We see this with the bystander effect. In fact, helping can be scary in many ways. Perhaps the homeless person you give money to is aggressive or addled and they end up trying to follow you. Perhaps they aren't even homeless and are simply trying to get money to spend on drugs or alcohol. Perhaps you see someone hurt, but you don't want to get in the way or you don't know what to do. Perhaps you feel that you want to help, but you have no idea how. Or perhaps, as we see in the case of the Spanish Moor, someone has done the unforgivable and you can barely look at them, let alone be even cordial. Now let us be clear, a great heart is not a pushover heart. A great heart beats within your breast and gives you the strength to be kind when it is the right time. As the Bible says, there is a time and place for everything. And so a time to help and a time to step aside for those more capable. Like everything, I believe there is a balance to this. But in order for there to be a balance, one must first do something. And so, dear friends, what I would like to consider from this chapter is this. Do you know anyone with a great heart? Do you feel as though your heart is great? Would you have the strength and fortitude to do what the Spanish Moor did and honor his word, sending the Cavalier on his way? We may tell ourselves that yes, we could do such things as described in this chapter. But in reality it can be difficult, scary even, but that doesn't mean that instead you simply do nothing. To quote, "After a while, even the average man will overtop the highest wave of noble manhood yet given to the world." And so, friends, be kind, be balanced, be strong in your faith, honor, and integrity. Be true to your word, as your word is power. Be of great heart, and maybe together we can all contribute to the spirit of generosity, allowing it to prevail amongst us all. Pax vobiscum, everyone. Goodbye.